Hey, Facebook friends, here we are again. We are live at LaRuelist Café. And I would imagine many of you are probably watching this on my own personal Facebook page, but some of you are on LaRuelist Cafe, some of you are on the Capitol Black Caucus, and some of you are probably watching this live on YouTube. So I say to all of you, welcome, welcome, welcome. So today we have a guest. I am so thrilled about this guest that we have now and the topic that we're going to be discussing. You know, there are so many ways to learn about the history of individuals, cultures, people, towns, what has happened in one era of America as opposed to another. And there's no place like learning about the families that came up through various towns than walking through a cemetery and looking at the family members who were there, the day they were born, the day that they passed away. But we have this guest who's coming on here today. You know, as a 70-year-old African American woman, unfortunately, I have gone to a lot of funerals. And one of the things that I noticed when I was younger, not so much now, but when I was younger, when I went to funerals, if I went to the funeral of a white person, all of the folks buried in that cemetery, they were white. If I went to a funeral of an African American person, all of the people buried in that cemetery were black. And so I used to wonder, well, can black people be buried with white people? I mean, is there some law to keep us from being buried together? So I would often wonder about it, but I never thought about the fact that after slavery and during Jim Crow ism, I never thought about the fact that there could be people who would be buried in unmarked graves. And for years, for decades, whole families could be buried in unmarked graves. And then developers might even come along and build buildings or housing units or whatever happens with military over these graves. I never really thought about it. Well, our guest today is going to talk about what was uncovered down in Florida. He is a reporter, he's a journalist, an award-winning journalist. If you know the name Guzzo, his name is Paul Guzzo. And if it sounds familiar, it's because he has, we call him the famous father here in New Jersey in politics, Dr. Peter Guzzo and Eileen. So this is their son, and I want him to talk about how they uncovered thousands of graves where developments had been built over them. And they just keep stumbling over more cemeteries where black people had been buried. And they're there, no kind of markings on it, and what has evolved from that. So without further ado, we're going to bring to you our guest today. Paul, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for being here with us today from sunny Florida. Is it sunny down there, or what's it like right now?
It's sunny and about 60 degrees, which is a little too cold for us.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, we'll take the 60 degrees up here in New Jersey. I tell you, it was too cold for me this morning. I usually walk 3 to 4 miles every morning, and I couldn't get out there today because it said 34 degrees, but feels like 27. So I went back to sleep. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. Tell us a little bit about who you are, you know, your family, and what you do down there in Florida.
Well, I'm originally from Ewing. I moved down to Tampa in 1999, and I've been a journalist down here ever since. I'm currently with the Tampa Bay Times, where I cover a wide variety of things. I cover film and television. I cover U.S.-Cuba relations, and then I cover history and culture.
Wow, great, great. And you're a family man. I think you have some athletes in your household.
I've got 4 children, ages 15, 12, 9, and 7. Yeah, the girls dance. My oldest son plays soccer, and my youngest is a baseball player who goes for his black belt on Saturday.
Black belt. How old is he?
He's 9, so it's a children's black belt. You know, if you ever
But it's a black belt.
yeah, the kid's black belt. He'll have to get another black belt when he's an adult. I don't think they'll count this one for when he's an adult.
Well, as a parent and a grandparent, I'm counting it. It counts
Okay.
for me. So tell me, Paul, and tell the viewers how this whole issue came up about the black cemeteries that you've been uncovering.
Well, there's another cemetery that's not missing. It's a clearly marked cemetery in Tampa, and it's called the Cemetery for All People. And it's what you would consider a potter's field, which is, in the early 1900s, potter's fields were cemeteries for the poor and the unidentified. So when someone couldn't afford to bury their family member or no family members claimed a body, the Hillsborough County, which owns the cemetery, they would get buried there, and usually without a marker. So it's just an empty plot of land, fenced in, called a cemetery, but there's no names or anything like that to say who's buried there. So this guy, Ray Reed, he is the retired head of the Hillsborough County Indigent Healthcare system. And when he learned about this cemetery, since he spent his career taking care of indigent people, he said, well, even in death, these people need respect. So he started going through death records from around the early 1900s through around the last burial in this cemetery, which is in like the 1950s. And every time he found a death record for the Cemetery for All People, he would pull the death record and he started making a list. And I think last time I spoke, he's still doing this. And last time I spoke to him, he had come up with over 1,000 people buried there. And there's supposedly thousands. So I did a story on him in September of 2018. And when we got done the interview, we spent the day with him. We shot video photos. He said, well, the real story is Zion Cemetery. And I looked at him. I was like, well, what's Zion Cemetery? And he says, well, that's the question. He says, I keep finding death records for Zion Cemetery. Everyone who's buried there is African-American or Afro-Cuban, is black. And he said, so it must have been an all-black cemetery because I've never found a white death record. And in the early 1900s, cemeteries in the South were segregated. You didn't bury whites and blacks next to each other. And he's like, not on maps. Nobody knows where it was. So what happened to all the people who were buried there? And I thought, well, it sounds a little like a conspiracy theory to me, and I don't really follow those. So I actually didn't really give it much credibility. I just kind of blew it off. But James Borchuk, a photographer with the Times who was with me, he kept on me. He kept saying, well, what if he's not crazy? And I was like, well, it sounds insane. And James kept saying, yeah, but think about it. We only know of one all-black cemetery in Hillsborough County, and it's got a few thousand burials there. Are you trying to tell me that in the early 1900s, only a few thousand black people died in the entire county? I realized he had a point. So we started looking into it. We found Zion Cemetery's location on maps from the early 1900s and old phone directories. We realized at that point the land where Zion was located is now housing projects, warehouses, and a tow lot. So we knew it existed. We started looking for death records. We found a couple hundred to start. So then we realized, all right, a couple hundred people were buried there. We know where it's at. Were they moved? We couldn't go in with a shovel and see if there were bodies there. We didn't have access to ground penetrating radar, and we couldn't just write a story saying the bodies are there. We needed evidence. But without being able to prove they're there, what we did, James and I, who was my partner on this story, is we had to prove that we couldn't find evidence that they weren't there. So what we did is, we found about 382 death records to begin with. And
382 people could be buried.
Yeah.
Under a housing development.
But we had to, we couldn't prove they were there. So we had to prove they weren't somewhere else. So we then entered those names into every cemetery database in the county, including the city-owned cemeteries, and we didn't find any of them. We looked in old news articles because cemeteries getting moved in the early 1900s was not abnormal in Hillsborough County. All the cemeteries were placed on the outside of the county, and as the city and the county started growing outwards, that land was no longer on the outskirts. It was land they needed. So they would move cemeteries, and it would always make front page stories. I mean, when you're moving hundreds of bodies, it's a spectacle even back then. So it would be front page stories. We found not a single article mentioning that Zion Cemetery was moved. So there were no records of the bodies anywhere, no newspapers saying that they were anywhere else. So we wrote a story at that point, not saying they were there, saying we have no evidence that they're anywhere. So what happened to these people? So within days of us writing it, the Tampa Bay Housing Authority, which owns the land where part of Zion is, they hired archaeologists. Our story ran in June of 2019, and in August 2019, they announced they had found hundreds of the ground penetrating radar had found hundreds of graves. And now we only found a few hundred death records. Since then, archaeologists have found nearly 1,000. And archaeologists are pretty certain nearly all 1,000 are probably still there. So they vacated the buildings, moved those families. The warehouses are going to stop being used at some point. The tow lot will stop being used. What they're going to do is they're going to sell. Three different owners own what was Zion Cemetery. So all three owners are going to sell the land to a nonprofit who's going to clear it and now set up a memorial, like a new cemetery, a memorial park in the coming years.
Well, Paul, I have a few questions to ask you about this. I mean, my heart just sank when you said thousands.
Yeah.
So I guess the housing that they built over these bodies were for poor people. So who lived over the cemeteries?
So I need to be clear. They didn't originally build those. All right. So the cemetery buried people till around 1923. In 1926, two white developers purchased the land. The original black owners had lost it in the early 1900s. It bounced around to a few white owners. These developers bought it in 26. In 1929, they received tax credits from the city of Tampa for owning a cemetery because you don't pay taxes. But that same year that the county or the city said you don't have to pay taxes on that land, they also approved building permits to build storefronts. So the city in one corner of the mouth was saying at the cemetery, and the other corner of the mouth was saying go ahead and build storefront. So they built storefronts in 29 on top of them. They just picked up the headstones, moved them, and built storefront. Then they built a few houses behind it. And then the rest of the cemetery was still there until around the 30s, where the rest of the headstones disappeared in the 30s. This is what we've learned since the first article. Then in 1950, the Tampa Housing Authority needed land to build a housing project for whites only. So they eminent domained that entire area of town, including what used to be the cemetery. The cemetery was no longer visible. While building a housing project, they uncovered 3 caskets, did not look for more. That made the newspapers, and the city said, well, all the bodies were moved in the 20s, so whatever. And so the housing authority kept building. They built acres of these housing projects for whites only at the time. Since then, those housing projects have been integrated, and now they're primarily used by African Americans.
That is an amazing story. Yeah. An amazing story. Were you able to locate any of the family members of the ancestors who were buried in Zion?
So we printed in our first story, when we had about 382 names to start, we actually printed every name in a newspaper, hoping families would reach out to us. None of them did. Since then, genealogists have taken on the cause, and they're looking for all. Now that we have almost 1,000 death records, they're looking for almost all the family members for them. They've had a few hits. We're waiting till they find all of them before we move on to that. The Tampa Bay Times, myself and some other researchers personally found six ancestors, and when we reached out to them, it was always the same story. I've never heard of that family member, and I would say, well, these are the other family members mentioned on the death record. These were their parents. This is the witness, and they would say, yeah, I know those names, but I've never heard of the person who's buried. And we would show them the genealogical records. They say, yeah, that's my descendant. Or their ancestor, but they had never heard of that person. They'd never heard of Zion. When Zion was erased, it's something I've heard from quite a few historians. They would say, well, my grandparents who were black, they wouldn't want to talk about the horrific things that happened to them in the early 1900s. They didn't like to talk about how terrible it was here in the South. So they would just try to ignore it, and they would never pass on the story. So it would seem when Zion disappeared, not only did those hurt by the fact that their family cemetery was built over, stop talking about the cemetery, it just seemed like they wanted to forget about the people who were born there. They didn't want to tell those stories. So not only the cemetery wiped out, the people who were buried there were completely erased from Tampa history. And
it's like they never existed.
And some of these people were very important pioneers. I mean, we found out there's one guy, L.G. Caro. He was pretty much the only African American pastor in town who could marry other African Americans. At one point, before things got real ugly here, there was talk of him running for city council as a black man.
Wow.
Once Jim Crow came in effect and a black man couldn't run for politics, he was the key endorsement if you wanted the black vote here. White politicians would run headlines in the paper saying, "We got LG Caro's endorsement." He helped establish churches here. If you asked any historian prior to our story who LG Caro was, they would have never have known, because he got buried there and just forgotten about.
Forgotten.
Yeah.
What was your feeling because you're still a northerner? I know you live in
Yeah.
Florida, but how did you feel as you went through the story? Because I'm a writer too, and I know pretty soon the story really, it takes over your being.
Yeah. So everybody, when I was doing the research, the Tampa Bay History Center was very instrumental in helping me out. I had archaeologists at the University of South Florida helping me. I had other historians helping me. And when I would come to them and say, "This is what we're working on," they would all say, "Well, the bodies are still there." I was like, "No, they're not." I just couldn't imagine it. I kept saying, "No, I think those bodies were probably dug up and put in a potter's field in that cemetery that started it all." I said, "I bet they were put there. There's no way the bodies are still there. Nobody would be that bold to just pick up the headstones and move them." I couldn't imagine that something that horrific could happen. Because I grew up, in Ewing. You
Right.
didn't see stuff like that there, or at least when I grew up there, I didn't see it. And all the historians I spoke to, like, "No, the bodies are still there," and I wouldn't believe them up until the day the archaeologists announced they were still there. I still refused to believe something that horrible would happen.
During an era, Paul, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, and when you think about the deepness of what we're talking about right now, I mean, this is the very essence of our living.
Yeah.
We're all on planet Earth to fulfill certain responsibilities and missions. And when it's over, we leave behind that legacy. And when you think about the fact that even these Black lives did not matter, to the point that developers could just build storefronts and
Mhm.
housing projects. Tell us about the MacDill situation, because I know we have another
Well,
questionable issue.
so since the Zion Cemetery story ran, so there'd always been talk, I guess, of there were cemeteries out there. While no one had heard of Zion anymore, there were talks over for years. People were like, "Well, so and so cemetery is missing. So and so cemetery is missing," but nobody ever took them seriously because it didn't seem like that was a possibility until our story with Zion ran and the archaeologists confirmed the bodies. And suddenly, everybody who had ever said, "I told you there's a cemetery there. I told you there's a cemetery there," started coming forward again. So one of them was MacDill. There had been talk for years that when MacDill Air Force base was built, in one of the far corners of it, that land used to be the Port Tampa Cemetery. So I went looking, and I actually found in the 1930s, the WPA, one of the ways they were employing people, to get out of the Depression, was they employed people to go around the country and make a catalog of cemeteries. So it's actually, they didn't finish, but they did a lot of them. So it's like roadmaps to cemeteries. They list the name of the cemeteries, and they actually give directions for how you would get there, to the foot, to the mile, to the inch, where you turn. So we followed the directions for how to get to Port Tampa Cemetery like a treasure map, and it took us to the fence of MacDill, and we couldn't go any further because it was there. So we reached out to MacDill, and they said, "Yeah, we know there could be a cemetery here." Apparently, somebody had already alerted them to it. So they went looking, and a few weeks ago, their report was released, and they said the report is inconclusive, meaning the ground penetrating radar found what seems to be graves, but they've yet to confirm their graves. But they found objects, the shape of graves, buried in the direction that graves are buried, at the depth of graves where the WPA map says the graves are. So there are graves there. I can't remember how many they found. I think they found 9. There's only about, I say only, but only about 30 something death records for people who are buried there. But there's probably more, because what we have found is death records, especially for African Americans, were not widely recorded in the early 1900s. Like, we found not a single death. We know Zion took burials as early as 1901, but you won't find a death record prior to 1910. At some point after 1910, death record became more the norm. So not sure how many people are buried in MacDill, but I mean, yeah, it would seem when MacDill came in and they built the base, the cemetery got forgotten. Whether it got forgotten accidentally, whether it got forgotten purposely, we'll probably never know. You know, one of the things that would need a time machine. But at this point, they're going to the base had said that they will never build on that area of the land, and they'll keep it, you know, just believing it's a cemetery.
Well, one of the things, first of all, you've done some amazing work. I mean, this has, when I started reading some of your articles, it made me think about my own life. Because as I said, when I went to funerals in New Jersey and Virginia and Maryland, if they were African Americans, I never went to a cemetery where there was a white person who I knew was a white person buried in that cemetery. But I never thought about the fact that we could have thousands, tens of thousands of people after slavery. I know that during slavery, there was no regard how they discarded the bodies of Africans and African Americans slavery. But I never thought about the fact that after Jim Crow period, Reconstruction, that we would have tons of, and maybe all over the country, probably in the North as well, there are cemeteries of Black people where they're, you know, they're underneath all kinds of development.
Yeah, this is not a Tampa-centric problem. So when I was first researching and we were still unsure, like, could there be bodies there? So I remember asking one archaeologist, Jay Joseph, who I think he's out of North Carolina or Georgia, I can't remember where, but he specializes in finding lost Black cemeteries. And I said, you specialize in this. How common is it? And he sent me, sorry, my thumb got in the way. He sent me examples of 24 that have been found since, I believe, sometime in the 1990s around the country, typically during construction projects. I remember one example he sent me, they were turning an old courthouse somewhere in the country into a school, or vice versa. And when they were redoing the plumbing, they found pipes going right through caskets. So this is not a Tampa-centric problem. Now, in the past,
now, were those all Black? Were they all Black cemeteries?
Typically Black. You'll find Native American burial grounds on occasion, but the preeminent issue has been Black cemeteries. I mean, so we have found now in Tampa 5 in the past, you know, like 16, 17 months.
Just in Tampa.
Tampa Bay area, 2 in Clearwater, right. 3 in Tampa. And when I've asked people, like, well, why are we finding so many? And they said, because we're finally looking. But they said, if you went to communities throughout the South, you'd probably find the same thing. And when I say 5, we still have, it's still ongoing, looking for another 2, 3, at least another 3 that I know of that we're still looking for. Archaeologists have yet to get to. So you could find as many as 8. And if we're 5 times somebody has said, we believe there's a cemetery here, and 5 times they have found graves, you know, you can't say for certain those other 3 will find anything, but it's seeming more likely than not.
Well, this is phenomenal. Now, I know you wrote an article about a teacher recently. Tell me about that.
So so one of the cemeteries that they found was actually on a high school property. It was over on King High School property. Let's see, between 250 and 260 individuals were buried there. It was called Ridgewood Cemetery. They found that one, and luckily there was nothing built on it, so they just kept the land clear, and they said they're going to keep it as like a memorial park in the future. But one of the things the Hillsborough County School District has said they want to do is we should incorporate this into our curriculum. We have a cemetery on a high school property. This should be a learning experience. So I reached out to a teacher who's already doing that, actually, with a cemetery in Tarpon Springs called Rose Hill. And that cemetery is there. You can walk the cemetery and you can look at the graves. And what she has said is you can learn a lot about Black history through the cemeteries because it's not all in books. But when you walk the cemeteries, you can find names of pioneers. You can find job descriptions on some of these drawings that will teach you a lot about them. For instance, the one in Tarpon Springs, Rose Hill, you'll find people buried there that say they were sponge dock divers. So the sponge docks are famous in Tarpon Springs. Everybody, the story goes that the Greeks are the ones who made the sponge docks in Tarpon Springs famous. And you're right, or the Greeks made them famous. But they were originally black sponge dock divers, and it's something you won't find in a lot of history books. But if you walk through this black cemetery in Tarpon Springs, you will find graves with people that are marked as they were former sponge dock divers. So what this teacher says, if you walk through these cemeteries, you study the people who were buried there, you study the history of these cemeteries, it will teach you a lot about local history that you won't find in the history books.
One of the things that I was sitting here thinking about as you were walking through this, I used to be a high school English teacher, and I could really, because, people say to me, Janine, sometimes you're consumed with death. I'm not consumed with death. We are here for a certain amount of time, and we're all pretty much walking each other home. So you and I are part of that journey. We have met each other. We are walking each other home. And I think one of the things that I would have incorporated in my curriculum, if I had known you then, you're younger than any of my kids, so I would have not have known you then. In fact, you're younger than any of the students I taught. I feel so freaking old at times. But I would have given them the assignment. If you want to learn about this area, I want you to take a walk through the cemetery. Tell me what you find. Tell me about the families. Tell me about you learn a lot about the dates of how long people lived. You learn a lot about that. So I mean, Paul, you're doing an amazing body of work.
Well,
thank you for that.
To give an example, what you were just saying, in all these black cemeteries, you will see, considering what we're going through today, there was a huge spike in burials in 1918, 1919. And upon first glance, you might not think much of it until you realize that was the year of the pandemic. So, I mean, there is something you learn from cemeteries. You walk through those old cemeteries, you're going to find way more graves from 1918, 1919 than any other year. When you stop and think about it, there's a history lesson. I mean, that was the year of the flu.
Yeah. And I tell you, the other thing that we're going to learn, I think, during the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people now are opting for cremations.
Yeah.
So there's not even going to be an acknowledgement anywhere of that person's life unless we look at other ways to document that we were here.
Yeah, after seeing what happened to all these cemeteries, I've specifically told my wife, don't bury me, cremate me. I don't want a building put on top of me. And it's going to happen sooner or later,
Well, thank you so much for coming on LaRuelist Café today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to continue to read your writings. You write about some really fascinating things, and I'm sure we're going to have you on again. I don't know if you get up to New Jersey anytime. I live about 12 minutes from your mom and dad's house. Yeah, but once we're able to travel again, I'd like to meet you in person.
Absolutely, but if I come to New Jersey, it'll never be in the winter again. It'll have to be in the summer.
You know what? I have no doubt about that. Once you Floridians get down there, you don't want to come up here during the winter. And plus your mom and dad are down there in Florida all the time when we don't have a pandemic. They love it. They absolutely love it. All right, so there you have it. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Absolutely. Thank you very much. So viewers, we do thank you for signing on to LaRuelist Café. We hope that we have given you something to think about today. My goodness. And when we talk about the issue about Black Lives Matter, we're not talking about just Black lives when they're alive. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. No matter what form we are in, we want Black lives to matter. Thank you for joining us today.